Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are, perhaps good night. But welcome everybody to this third session of the conference. I hope that some of you have been able to attend the first two sessions, which have really been quite excellent. My name is Naomi Alboim, and I'm the Senior Policy Fellow at CERC, and I'll be the moderator for this session. Before we begin, though, I would like to acknowledge the land on which Ryerson University is situated in the spirit of reconciliation. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee peoples that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, for which we are grateful. The focus of this particular session will be on the evolution of current point systems for economic immigrants in three different countries: Canada, the UK, and Australia. We'll be asking whether they are fit for purpose going forward, given what we know about the future of work, our future labor market needs, the skills that will be needed, and what we have learned during COVID about essential work and work that can be done virtually from anywhere in the world. As many of you know, Canada was one of the first countries in the world to introduce a point system to select economic immigrants in the late 1960s. And this was done deliberately to remove the many overtly discriminatory and racist policies that existed at the time. Our point system has evolved over time and swung between emphasis on the recruitment of people to fill specific occupational shortages on the one hand, and on an emphasis on broader human capital on the other. It's also swung with more or less emphasis on job offers from employers, and gradually with much more of an emphasis on regional needs through a plethora of provincial nominee programs and pilot programs where the point system, in fact, does not apply, and a move towards more and more two-step immigration with a significant increase in the transition from temporary status to permanent residency for skilled temporary foreign workers and international students. This was brought home very dramatically when just last week, more than 27,000 invitations to apply were issued in just one draw from the express entry pool to immigration applicants in the Canadian Experience class. This was more than 5 times higher than the previous high for one day. The lowest point score to be drawn was 75, compared to the previous average of 400. 90% of those drawn are already in Canada, either as temporary skilled workers or international students. And this draw was done specifically because COVID has resulted in a 50% reduction of immigrant landings, and Canada is keen to meet its ambitious immigration targets going forward. However, even with this draw, this still leaves out many others who do not meet the language, education, and skilled work criteria for economic immigration. Canada, as you know, borrowed significantly from New Zealand's and Australia's expression of interest process at the very beginning of our express entry system. But it has evolved very differently here. And as you will hear, the UK has yet another interpretation of the Australian model. So it is my pleasure to introduce your panel members for this session, who will shed more light on the topic with a particular focus on whether our point systems in Canada, the UK, and Australia are selecting the people with the skills we need going forward. The first presenter will be Rupa Banerjee, who's the Associate Professor of Human Resource Management and Organisational Behaviour at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. The second presenter will be Anna, if in Canada, Boucher, if not, Boucher, who will present on behalf of herself and her co-author, Chris Wright. Anna is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on immigration policy and its intersection with the welfare state, gender equality, industrial relations, and employment law as it impacts immigration. And her co-author, Chris Wright, is also an associate professor, but in the discipline of work and organizational studies at the University of Sydney. Chris's research covers various issues relating to the intersection of employment, globalization, and public policy, with a particular interest in labor immigration and comparative employment relations and sustainable supply chains. The third presenter will be Peter Walsh, who will present on his behalf and that of his co-author, Madeleine Sumption. Peter is a researcher at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on UK immigration policy, including family migration, international students, asylum, detention, deportation, and the post-Brexit points-based immigration system. And his co-author is Madeleine Sumption, the director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford as well, which conducts research on UK immigration policy. Madeleine's research focuses on the economic and social impacts of immigration policies. Each presenter will speak for between 12 and 15 minutes, after which I will pose some questions to them and will also draw your questions from the chat box. So please enter your questions as our presenters speak and don't wait till the very end. I will be referring often to that chat box and hope to get to as many as I possibly can. After the session, CERC will be hosting a 20-minute virtual coffee break with both CERC researchers and some of our panelists today. So if you're interested in joining, please stay on the Zoom call. And now, over to you, Rupa. Could you please share your screen with us?
Sure, thanks, Naomi. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the Canadian case, of course. And my presentation today is on behalf of two co-authors as well, who I've been working on this project for a couple of years now. So before I get into my slides, I guess I should mention that we started our project in late 2018, so well before COVID came into the scene. So it's not directly on the impact of COVID, but I think that some of the discussion that hopefully we will have afterwards can get into how COVID impacts, some of the intricacies of the Canadian system as well. Okay, so as Naomi alluded to already, Canada's merit-based immigration system really focuses on trying to bring in skilled immigrants. And in 2019, about 58% of the permanent residents that entered did come in through the economic category. And the economic category focuses on skilled workers primarily, but has now expanded to other categories such as provincial nominee programs, as well as Canadian experience class as well. And within this economic category and the skilled workers program in particular, the points-based system selects newcomers based on factors such as language proficiency, education experience, and adaptability. This has been the case for a long time now, since really we adopted the point system 50 years ago. That being said, what researchers over the past several decades have really been grappling with is whether this points-based system, the skill-biased immigrant selection system, really does lead to the kinds of outcomes that we are looking for. So we know that studies have found that immigrant earnings gaps have gotten worse over time. So between 1986 and 2016, the earnings shortfall has grown. This is despite the fact that the immigrant selection system itself has been changed and amended a number of times to try and optimize the kinds of points that are given. And as Naomi said, sometimes focusing on specific occupations, sometimes focusing on more general human capital. In addition to this, a lot of new service sector provisions have been introduced and bridging programs have been introduced. But all of these efforts have really, at least up till the 2016 Canadian census that we can see, have really not produced huge benefits in terms of improving the immigrant disadvantage. So a lot of researchers have, of course, looked into the factors that have contributed to this disadvantage. And we know that the standard list of factors include things like the discounting of foreign credentials, the lack of Canadian experience, which seems to be even more important than the discounting of credentials, um, lack or perceived lack of English language skills or French language skills, and finally, the perceived lack of soft skills or corporate fit, cultural fit. So given that we know that these are the major factors that have contributed to immigrant disadvantage, Canada's evolving immigration policy has, since 2015, introduced express entry, of course. So express entry really works by first asking prospective immigrants to submit an online profile, which instead of a full application is simply an expression of interest. This expression of interest puts the candidates into an express entry pool where they are judged in terms of whether they meet the minimum eligibility requirements. Points are then awarded based on a comprehensive ranking system. So in many ways, it is very similar to the point system that has already existed, but it's the comprehensive ranking system that really makes it different. And the other really differing factor, the factor that makes express entry stand out, is that candidates with the highest scores are then invited to apply. So it's really a best in line approach rather than first in line approach. So I'm not sure if you can see this, the numbers are a bit small, but this is a kind of an overview of the comprehensive ranking system. And here we can really see the factors that are deemed to be the most important. So they include education, official language proficiency, age, and Canadian experience. And in addition to that, things like having a degree from Canada, as well as having arranged employment, and very importantly, for those who have a provincial nominee, these are the factors that put people over the edge. Of course, with COVID and the kinds of changes that we've seen in terms of numbers, the actual pass mark depends on the draw. So there have been times when the pass score is quite high, and there have been other times when the pass score drops dramatically in order to allow more to come in. In the beginning of the pandemic, the Canadian government really focused on bringing in or landing those who were already in Canada. So having draws that were exclusively for provincial nominees and Canadian experience class individuals who were already working or studying in Canada. In the latter part of 2020, it went back to more of a normal open system, which allowed people to actually apply from abroad. But in the very beginning, last couple of months, so the beginning of 2021, we have once again gone back to really focusing on individuals who are really just living and working and studying in Canada already. So express entry tries to combat the sources of immigrant disadvantage in a number of ways. First of all, given that credential discounting has been clearly shown to be one of the major factors leading to immigrant disadvantage, mandatory educational credential assessments have been introduced for those who are applying with foreign education. Secondly, extra points are awarded for having a Canadian post-secondary education, once again to combat the discounting of foreign credentials. Thirdly, in order to combat the discounting of foreign work experience, there's been a really strong emphasis on pre-landing Canadian work experience. Language testing has now been made mandatory. And very importantly, there's been a preference put on younger and younger candidates. So when we look at the numbers from the Express Entry year-end report from 2019, so obviously pre-pandemic, we can see that there's been a move away from federal skilled workers who tend to be applying from abroad, and a move much more towards Canadian experience class and provincial nominees. And so again, this kind of conforms with this idea that we are really focusing on those who are already residing in Canada. And pre-pandemic, about half of those applying were already living, working or studying in Canada. So one of the ways that Express Entry tries to tackle this issue of both language deficits, as well as this issue of cultural fit, is by really focusing on younger applicants. So what we can see from the 2019 numbers, for example, is that really the vast majority of people coming in are under the age of 30. And if you're over the age of 35 or so, you're really not likely to get in through express entry. So age has been really made into a proxy for adaptability. In addition to that, the biggest push that express entry has put forward in terms of points is to try and add points both for having arranged employment and having Canadian education, and of course, for having a provincial nominee. So these factors have been assigned additional points. But that being said, 40% of those who came in 2019 didn't have these additional points. So in many ways, express entry really is very similar to the previous point system that we did have before 2015. So express entry was introduced in 2015. We don't have a lot of reliable data yet on the effectiveness on express entry in terms of labor market outcomes. But we can kind of take a very informal glance at how labor market indicators are doing for brand new immigrants. And what we see is that relative to their Canadian-born workers, the unemployment rate of the very most recent immigrants seems to be trending slightly downwards since 2015. Similarly, the wages of immigrants, and particularly very recent immigrants, seems to be trending slightly upwards. I mean, these are very rough kind of eyeballing examinations of how the labor market outcomes of immigrants have been doing since 2015. They don't really tell us too much, but they give us an indication that perhaps the outcomes are getting slightly better. So what do we know so far? Well, we know that from another study that I have conducted with several other colleagues, that the emphasis, that mandatory ECA requirements, the Educational Credential Assessment requirement, improves employment and earnings. We know that this only applies, however, for those who have not worked in Canada before landing. We also know from others' research that the emphasis on pre-landing work experience, two-step migration, has a very positive effect on employment and earnings. So these are two important aspects of express entry, and these are known to actually have improved labor market outcomes to some extent. In order to explore how the introduction of express entry really is impacting immigrants as well as other stakeholders, my colleagues and I conducted interviews with key informants in the Greater Toronto Area between 2018 and 2020. So we really targeted settlement service providers, immigration consultants, as well as employers. So we conducted interviews with HR managers and other frontline managers to really try to get a sense of how express entry and the Canadian model has really been experienced on the ground. So our sample of employers includes quite a range of different industries. In terms of benefits, what we're hearing from the settlement service sector is that express entry really privileges the privileged. So we're hearing that express entry was designed to favor people who are already favored. It privileges those who are privileged. So in that sense, it succeeded. At least in the short term, I do think that people have an easier time settling because of the many people who go through express entry have in fact already been in Canada. So this sentiment that the two-step nature that's really focused on an express entry does tend to have a beneficial impact on newcomers. Again, another quote that really highlights the fact that for those who are especially in Canadian experience class, there's a real sense of already kind of being enmeshed in the system, and that has a beneficial effect for those individuals. When we spoke to the employers, it's interesting because most of them didn't really know what express entry was. So instead, we asked about new immigrants, newcomers, and their experiences of hiring and retaining newcomers. And we did hear a few HR managers and hiring managers discuss the ways in which they found that newer immigrants tend to have the skills they're looking for. So this HR manager said that we hired a large number of newcomers in the past couple of years because they had the kind of technical skills we were looking for. So in that sense, there seems to be some indication that employers are seeing that the technical skills of express entry entrants are strong. In terms of the limitations of express entry, of course, one of the major limitations is that it does not actually address the need for lower skilled, quote unquote, workers and skilled trades. So a study by Hu, Liu, and Shmelly in 2020 actually found that only half of the growth in university educated workers was matched to a growth in the jobs that require a university degree. So there's a real growth in the need for lower skilled workers, but the express entry system still focuses on bringing the quote unquote best and the brightest, with the assumption that that is really all we need in our labor market. And then when we think about the Federal Skilled Trades Program, only about 2% of the invitations to apply in 2019 fell under the FSTP. And we heard this from many of the employers that we interviewed. We heard about the challenges. So a line manager in the manufacturing sector said, we're experiencing skills shortages as an industry. I'm not sure how we're going to fill these positions. And this was a common sentiment that we heard over and over again. Then when we actually talked to the employers about their concerns about newcomer applicants and employees, the vast majority spoke about so-called soft skills. Things like communication skills, language skills, work ethic, understanding Canadian norms, fitting in the workplace, etc., were the most common concerns and issues that were brought up by employers. And again, many employers and many managers gave examples and instances where they felt that their newcomer applicants and employees in particular really couldn't fit in to the acceptable cultural environment of their workplaces. So these kinds of quotes, like there are some issues I've seen over the years with newcomer candidates, such as communication, cultural norms, that are acceptable in their home countries, but not accepted in Canada. The problem of soft skills, of course, is that there's a real lack in terms of how we define soft skills. There's a lack of consistency. There is no universal or even Canadian definition of soft skills, which allows the term of soft skills to be really applied to many different areas of concern. Not only that, even if one is to define soft skills, it is extremely difficult to assess, particularly with the kinds of measures that we use in immigrant selection. So the kinds of instruments that are used in immigrant selection are things that you can get a certificate for, like university degrees. But for assessing soft skills, the actual evaluation requires lengthy, in-depth evaluation and is still not very well accepted or well developed. And finally, soft skills has often been used to legitimize discrimination. And it's quite easy to actually throw a lot of bias and discriminatory behaviors into the term of soft skills, and using that criteria to actually exclude marginalized groups is quite convenient for employers. So in summary, we really don't have a lot of strong evidence in terms of the effectiveness of express entry in terms of immigrant integration. The data from the past 5 years or so seem to indicate that perhaps newcomers are doing slightly better, those who came in through express entry. However, a lot of concerns still remain. newcomers are still underemployed. And although two-step migration has positive results, we do have to acknowledge the cost of unchecked explosion of temporary migration that comes with it. Finally, soft skills are a major concern for employers, but should they be incorporated into the immigration system? Well, there are some efforts that have been put forward. In BC, the FAST program is currently being piloted to try and evaluate and train newcomers in a particular set of industries, in particular right now, before they even arrive. So something like that could be expanded. And other pre-arrival services could also be expanded to try and get people ready before they even set foot in Canada. We also need to address the need for workers of varying skill levels. Somehow finding ways to provide more pathways to permanent residence for low-skilled migrant workers would really address the need for all kinds of workers rather than only focusing on the highest skill. And finally, and most crucially, I think we really need to include employers in this discussion. And we need to provide training and resources to employers without, and instead of putting the burden entirely on immigrants and the immigration system, we need to also include employers in the process to acknowledge and reduce implicit bias and better incorporate newcomers into their workplaces. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupa. I'm sure that there are already lots of comments and questions, and I certainly have some that I want to pose to you as well, but that was a great introduction to the Canadian system. Next speaker, please. And the next speaker is Peter.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Splendid. So first of all, it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be here, and I'm extremely grateful for the invitation. So our paper is on the history of point systems in the UK. And it turns out that the UK is a particularly fruitful case study for understanding them. We have a long-standing public and political debate on point systems, and we've implemented various forms of them over the last 20 years. The most recent, called the points-based immigration system, was introduced on the 1st of January this year. It promises to be a firm and fair immigration system following the end of EU freedom of movement on the 30th of December. Somewhat confusingly, this new post-Brexit points-based immigration system replaced what was also known as the points-based immigration system introduced in 2008. But in addition to a name, these systems also share something else in common. Both were sold as Australian style. Now in the UK, Australian style seems to have some cachet, and not only in immigration debate recently, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that the UK had to develop an Australian style trade policy with the EU. But with regard to immigration, surveys show consistently that there is strong public support for the idea of an Aussie-style point system, and politicians going back at least 15 years have continually promised them, even if what they've ultimately delivered are not point systems in the Australian sense. So in our paper, what we're really trying to find out is what accounts for the enduring appeal of point systems in the UK. Could it be that a point system really is a kind of quasi-magical tool for managing migration, as politicians suggest, and as the public appears to believe, or is something else going on? Now, the UK's first experiment with a point system was in 2002, when it introduced under the premiership of Tony Blair, the highly skilled migrant programme, or HSMP. Its main stated objective was to enable people with, quote, high human capital to migrate to the UK in order to look for work, and thereby, and this was another part of the aim, to address skills shortages, especially in areas of high skill like science, medicine, and finance. In this policy, human capital was assessed across 5 areas, and it was possible to accrue as many as 155 points when only a threshold of 75 needed to be met to qualify. So there was genuine flexibility in how the criteria could be met. The HSMP actually reflects, I think, quite a notable shift in UK immigration policy, because it was the first time that a migrant could come to the UK to work long term without having a job offer in advance. Now, the UK has continued to have a genuine point system until 2011. Most notably from 2008, the UK's main skilled worker route, which was for non-EU workers, was a hybrid route in which the applicant did require a job offer, but there was genuine flexibility in how applicants could meet the criteria by scoring points. But in 2011, that was all changed so that to qualify, all applicants simply had to do was meet a list of mandatory criteria to which a fixed number of purely symbolic points were attached. And in fact, from 2011 to 2021, no aspect of the UK's points immigration system was points-based in any traditional sense of the term. Points were attached to mandatory criteria, and you had to meet all of the criteria in order to qualify. So now we have the post-Brexit 2021 points-based system, and what does that look like? Well, as with the system it replaced, the term points-based immigration system is used to describe the whole range of labour and student routes, but actually only one of these routes meaningfully involves points, and that's the main work route, known as the skilled worker route. Now, this was sold as Australian style, but it's not really like Australia's PBS. In Australia, perhaps the best known point system there, the skilled independent route, does not require a job offer, although many will have one lined up. But more importantly, there's flexibility in how the points can be gained. By contrast, in the UK, the skilled worker route is a standard employer-led work permit system where applicants have to meet certain salary thresholds. That's the core of the system, and that's broadly the same as what was in place for non-EU citizens before free movement ended. Now, it's true, the route does involve counting points. The successful applicant needs to win 70, but 50 of these are mandatory. They're gained through a good command of English, having a job offer with an approved sponsor, and for that job being middle skilled or higher. And the remaining 20 points are awarded for meeting a salary threshold for the future job, which is generally set at £25,600. The Australian twist, if you will, is that the applicant can qualify for the route on a lower salary if, for example, the job is in a shortage occupation or the applicant has a PhD that's relevant to the job they'll be doing. So while involving points, it's not really a point system in most substantive respects. It requires a job offer, and there's very little flexibility in how the points can be won. In fact, it behaves just like a traditional employer-led system. So what have politicians actually hoped to achieve with the various point systems that they've implemented over the years? Well, when we look back at political papers and discourse and policy documents, certain themes do come up again and again. They are objectivity, flexibility, transparency, and perhaps most importantly of all, control. So, for example, as far back as 2005, we see Tony Blair promising to replace, quote, outdated and confusing rules with a clear and modern point system. A government white paper from the mid-2000s speaks to flexibility when it states, quote, "It will be straightforward to adjust the points levels to respond to changes in the labour market." There are also references in policy documents of the time to points being, quote, "more transparent and streamlined, delivering greater efficiency and more certainty for applicants about the outcome of their application." Now, reinforcing this focus on control, Madeleine actually interviewed a number of senior civil servants, and one said quite tellingly, I think, of policymaking in the mid to late 2000s, quote, "The whole thrust of policy was trying to demonstrate that the government and the Home Office could actually control the immigration system, because the sense was that immigration was out of control and nobody could manage it. That was the total preoccupation," end quote. And it's a preoccupation that seems to be shared, by the way, by the British public. Surveys consistently show that support for PBSs are remarkably high, despite the public generally knowing little about immigration policy. But importantly, they know what they want. As one study from 2018 that I think demonstrates this quite persuasively, it comprised 60 focus groups on immigration across the UK, and it found that participants argued in support of an Australian-style point system in all 60 focus groups. The researchers therefore noted that a point system, quote, "appeared to be shorthand for a controlled immigration system that meets the economy's needs." Now, that's a finding that dovetails with media research in the UK that shows that control is a central theme in media reporting. The Financial Times recently added to this evidence by noting that in the government's own focus groups on the issue, the phrase "Australian style" had a clear association with toughness, calling to mind perhaps refugees being turned away at gunpoint in boat by the Australian Navy, even though, of course, that has absolutely nothing to do with Australia's point system. But that certainly finds support in some of the proclamations of Boris Johnson, for example, when he said, quote, "We must be tougher on those who abuse our hospitality. Other countries, such as Australia, have great systems, and we should learn from them." So that's what politicians and the public want from point systems. But can they actually achieve those goals of giving governments a high level of control in their selection of skilled labour migrants? Well, the argument that point systems give greater control has some intuitive pull. It's based on them deriving from government-set criteria, where selection is made by the government without being delegated, if you will, to employers. But through employer-led systems, governments can actually control quite a lot, I would suggest. They can decide the kind of work that migrants will be doing, the wages they should receive, whether they can change jobs, and the employer that they work for. Now, that type of control is almost universally absent from point systems that do not require a job offer. Therefore, we would offer, perhaps counterintuitively, that point systems perhaps offer slightly less control than selection systems that are based on employer sponsorship. Now, that's somewhat theoretical, but more empirically, it's difficult to assess the success of these point systems because there's insufficient evidence to do so. And that very lack of evidence points, I think, to an irony in the implementation of the UK's point systems. These, after all, have apparently been conceived to embody objective, clear, controlled labour migration policy, yet the government never gathered the data to be able to rationally evaluate them against those aims, and so ultimately has never been able to realise its apparent technocratic vision. So this returns us to the question, of what the appeal of point systems is. Because if they don't necessarily give governments more control, and they can't make good on their substantive policy aims, in many cases there's not even the evidence to test that, then we're pushed, I think, to another conclusion, that a major part of the appeal of point systems is not substantive, but instead symbolic. That point systems create an impression of objectivity and transparency, that their numerical character makes them seem fairer by apparently removing the subjective discretion of decision makers, and that points embody a firm but fair meritocracy. The person who scores highest on the test wins the prize. Then there's this phrase, Australian style, which has a widespread and demonstrable association with uncompromising control. Exactly what British politicians try to demonstrate, and what, as we've seen, the public wants to see. And I suppose the final proof, if you will, that PBSs embody symbolic rather than substantive policymaking is that the latest PBS introduced earlier this year is a PBS in name only. It's a standard employer-led system masquerading as a points-based system. So ultimately then, point systems in the UK have been the answer to public concerns about, amongst other things, uncontrolled immigration. They're presented as an objective and tough policy solution, a view that the public appears to share. But for all that, I think it probably seems safe to say that the public and politicians are probably putting too much faith in what is, on the face of it, a rather unassuming technical policy tool that on its own has never really evidenced the capacity to transform migration as it is presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You have laid out a wonderful description of what it is and is not, or is perceived to be, but is not. So thank you very much, Peter. And we're on to the third presenter, and Anna, over to you. And I think you may be muted.
Mute. Okay, how's that? Is that better?
Much better. Thank you. We can hear you.
Sorry about that. So thanks for having Chris and myself here today to talk about the Australian points tests and skilled immigration policies. We've just heard a lot about what Boris Johnson thinks the Australian skilled immigration approach is, and today I'll be talking more detail about what it actually is. And I guess the key take home is actually the Australian system is quite complex, has many aspects, but the overall characterisation that Chris and I observe in recent years from a detailed analysis of what's known as policy advice manuals, which are, I guess, the documents that immigration officials use to interpret the legislation and regulations, is that we're seeing a shift away from hard towards soft skill in the overall characterisation of skilled selection. And I'll substantiate this for our presentation. As we know from this panel, immigration policy in many countries is increasingly focused on a skilled approach. And I think this is an overall trend, but within migration studies scholarship in particular, the concept of skill is probably underutilised and under-critiqued. So we draw upon scholarship from industrial relations and management studies to answer the question of to what extent soft skills are a selection criteria in skilled immigration selection policy that has traditionally focused on hard skills. And Australia is a useful case study here, both because we have obviously been one of the forerunners in the area of points test migration, Canada being the first, Australia being probably the second country in the world to adopt a points test, which has historically at least focused very much on hard skills, education, qualifications, language skills, and professional training. But we argue that this is changing and has been changing actually quite rapidly over the last decade. If you look at the scholarship on skill, Payne perhaps gives the most famous definition of skill. He notices that it has both objective and subjective properties, owing to the way in which skill is socially constructed and embedded within social and power relations. Hard skill is based on at least seemingly objective criteria, such as required qualifications, and soft skill based on more seemingly subjective criteria, such as interpersonal qualities, although we'll get into the complex detail of soft skill shortly. And there is emerging evidence, and we saw this in Rupa's presentation as well, that soft skill is associated with employers gaining greater power over defining what constitutes skill. And this is not only true in the immigration area, but also in more broadly in employment studies. Soft skill in selection can also raise potential diversity bias concerns. I've looked at this with regards to gender, but the Moss and Tilley piece that Rupa cited looks at this with regards to ethnicity and race. So if we look at the question of soft skill, it's really can be very capaciously defined to encompass emotional labour, aesthetic labour, the appearance of somebody, articulation work, communication, problem solving, teamwork, leadership, resilience, attitude, resilience again, obviously resilience is important, motivation, loyalty, and even compliance, subservience to the employer. So the wide variety of soft skill attributes, according to Grugelis, brings together a confused morass of personal traits, attitudes, qualities, and predispositions. And there are some arguments in favour of using soft skill for employee selection. One is that soft skill allows a worker to utilise their qualifications and technical knowledge, that those qualifications are necessary but not sufficient to be skilled in the workplace. And another, I guess, more obvious one is that it's what employers want. And we just saw that in the last two presentations in terms of interviews with employers. They are very much seeking employees who have these qualities. A counter argument is that it can be used to support and legitimise, or even in some instances to challenge gender and racial discrimination. So that depending on your perspective, that could be a good or a bad thing. And there are various studies finding that employers perceive workers from certain migrant community groups as being more or less reliable or suitable for a job. So it can definitely increase discrimination, and there are some good studies that analyse that issue. Within the immigration space, we know from the broader employment scholarship that there is considerable research that increasing reliance on soft skill compounds the opportunity for stereotyping. And Anderson and Roux is applying this logic in the UK actually to the question of immigration selection, argue that it brings out attributes and characteristics that are related to employer control. I think this is particularly an issue in the area of employer-sponsored skilled visas, where we know that temporary visa workers may be willing to work harder for a specific period to qualify for permanent residency or citizenship. I'm currently working with some migrant cases where the migrants were on employer-sponsored temporary visas and were paid no money at all over the entire course of their temporary visa on the promise that they would be sponsored for a permanent visa. So these are kind of very hard examples of what I've just mentioned. Sometimes there may be lesser forms of control, but there are examples in Australia at least, in the case law, where temporary visa holders have been paid nothing in pursuit of a permanent skilled visa. Sponsorship arrangements that tie workers to their employer sponsor increase compliance, which some studies have identified as a form of soft skill. Okay, so moving on to Australia. This is a graph that Chris made for us, where you can see over the last quarter century, 25 years, what's happened just in the skilled space. So we've taken out family and humanitarian and New Zealanders. And unusually we've combined both temporary and permanent migration, which is not always done. So I guess the first observation is that leading up to COVID, we had rapidly increasing rates of immigration across this period of time. And actually a lot of that growth was in the skilled area. Also, you'll see that the black line, which is temporary employer sponsored, the temporary skills shortage visa, now known as the 457 visa, has increased the most rapidly, although it does fluctuate based on employer demand and cycles. You'll see there was a dip in 2009 when the global financial crisis happened. The next thing that you can observe is that the category which I think Boris Johnson believes is the Australian styled points test, the permanent skilled independent class, has actually decreased in both the levels that have been set and in intake since about 2007. And in 2018 to 19, the skilled independent intake was about 43,000. And in 2019-2020, it was 16,552. So a very significant drop in recent years in that particular category. In contrast, some of the employer-sponsored categories, such as the ENS, Employer Nominated Scheme, have increased and eclipsed the skilled independent. So these are the fundamental shifts that we see in the skilled immigration space in Australia in recent years. Now, in terms of what this means for hard skill and soft skill, that's what I want to get into with a little bit more detail now. And that's where reading these policy advice manuals was a useful exercise to really look at a very detailed, granular policy level, what is happening with all of these visas. Okay, now anyone who knows about Australia will know that immigration law is extremely complex, and even within these headings that Chris and I have put here, there are what are known as subclasses and sub-visas. So I'm not going to get into the minutiae, but needless to say, there's a lot of detail. With the skilled independent subclass 189 visa, as it's known, this is the one that I think is closest to a traditional points test. Here there are educational requirements, English proficiency requirements. You need to be on a designated skilled occupation list, and there's a skilled assessment, as is now the case in Canada, it appears. And an expression of interest system adds an additional layer of selection. I would characterise this as the closest to what we have as a hard skilled visa, although there can be points if you have Australian experience with an Australian employer. So even in the hardest of the points test visas in Australia, there is a soft skill component, insofar that experience with an employer, obviously an existing relationship with them, can give you actually quite a lot of points. The skilled employer sponsored schemes, this is a kind of omnibus category that includes employer nomination scheme that I mentioned before, a regional sponsorship scheme, and we've also included here a regional skilled visa, which there is not formal sponsorship on, but the migrant gets points for agreeing basically to move outside of the major cities in Australia, which a willingness to move and relocate, I think, is more appropriately characterised as a soft than a hard skill. This operates like the skilled independent visa, but with key differences. Firstly, and I think this is interesting, there's a trade-off with English. So only competent rather than proficient English is required. And there are additional requirements such as having an ongoing job offer from a nominating employer. Applicants can apply onshore rather than being required to apply offshore. All of that's changed since COVID. And obviously the relationship with the employer is central. There needs to be a person-organisation fit insofar that there's an existing job offer. So without the job offer, applicants are not successful for these particular skilled employer schemes. So clearly soft skill is implicit in the selection criteria for these particular visas. And as I've noted in the last slide, it's clear that the ENS type schemes are the ones that are now predominant within skilled immigration selection in Australia. Next, we have the temporary skills shortage visa. I guess this is most similar to the temporary foreign worker visa in Canada, the high skilled version, because we have a salary threshold, which means it's harder to bring in low skilled workers, although there have been attempts through a variety of ways to do that. The stated objective of this visa, now known as the temporary skills shortage, previously you may have heard the term 457 visa, was to address shortages of hard skills. But Chris and I argue in the paper that actually what we're seeing is a strong use of soft skill for this visa. Firstly, the list of occupations is very broad, so it doesn't really target shortages that effectively, although it has been whittled down somewhat in recent years. And the employer sponsorship is a core necessary feature of this visa, including with restrictions on the capacity for the employee to change jobs should they lose their employment. I think they can change jobs. They have a minimum amount of time, otherwise they're unlawfully in Australia. And as I gave the example of these employees who were paid nothing for that period where they were working on this visa, although that's not necessarily always the case, but there are many egregious examples under this visa, loyalty, teamwork, compliance are clearly attributes that are important for visa holders. And interestingly, many of the people who are on this visa subsequently apply for the employer nominated scheme visa. So the loyalty is not just to the workplace and the employer, but also to the possibility of future access to Australia as a permanent resident. And then we have a new visa, the Global Talent Visa. This was introduced in 2019, but you can see that the intake has increased quite rapidly, even in this short period of time, from 5,000 to 15,000. And this targets occupations in sectors with considerable hard skill requirements, so mainly the STEMs areas. There's a panel of experts from industry and the academy who are responsible for identifying certified trusted employers, and there the application process can be fast-tracked. So while this visa clearly has some hard skill components, in particular the STEMs areas that are targeted are ones that would require high levels of educational training. Also, there is a soft skill component insofar that a job offer from a trusted employer is a required aspect of this visa. So in conclusion, hard skills are often necessary but insufficient for skilled immigration visa applicants to apply in Australia. And at least until COVID, we had massive excess demand to migrate to Australia, which I think justifies, from a government perspective, this combination of hard and soft skill. We've had a large bank of applicants in the expression of interest system and large numbers of visa applications more broadly. I mean, this is now clearly changing with COVID because Australia is very hard to access at present. But I'm guessing that from a government perspective, it is possible to overlay a soft skill component with a hard skill requirement because there has been the demand to enter Australia. Further, the evidence that we have from longitudinal studies shows that those migrants, in the short term at least, who are linked to employer do better in the labour market. So what this makes clear is that while hard skills are important in Australia for selection, soft skills are often a key determinant for employer recruitment and visa selection decisions. And some visas have allowed employers more discretion to select candidates and to fit with the organisation at hand. So the basic conclusion we come to is that if we were to characterise skill in Australia in the immigration space, we would say that soft skills can be viewed as the interior of selection decisions and hard skills as the exterior. And if any of you are interested in reading our paper or commenting on it, please email me and I'm happy to share and would love your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. There are many, many questions, and I'm trying to group them in ways that may be helpful for the conversation. And I'm going to pose actually 3 questions. And from that, I think we can have a sort of jumping off point. So first of all, Peter, your paper presented different perspectives on whether a point system gives government more control over immigration than employer-led systems. And if the object is not government control, but rather what leads to the best long-term outcomes for a country's economy, what would you recommend versus, a government point system or an employer led system? But hold on, because I want to frame it a little bit differently for Anna. And I would ask, given the relative proportions of employer-sponsored temporary workers and employer-sponsored permanent immigrants relative to permanent independent entrants in Australia, is the balance being tilted too much towards the role of employers in immigrant selection? And to Rupa, I'd like you to ask whether you see two-step immigration as an implicit way to build in soft skills into the immigration selection system by virtue of either, going to school here as an international student or working as a skilled temporary worker where more soft skills may be acquired. So I guess I'm asking all of you the issue of, are we giving too much control to employers? Is that going to be helpful in the long term or not? Both in terms of the importance or not of soft skills in the selection process. So anybody can start. Rupa.
So I absolutely think that whether it's explicitly articulated or not, the reliance on two-step immigration and the growth in temporary workers that went along with that are a way to build in the soft skills requirements into our immigration system. The question is whether that is the right move and whether that is actually working in the way that it's intended to. And I think the evidence shows that it is not necessarily working in the way that it's intended to. I mean, the answer is kind of yes and no, right? I think that when we look at the outcomes of those who worked in a high quality, high paying job in Canada as a temporary worker before becoming permanent, it is very true that they do well. They do very well. But that is crucial to say that they had a high quality, high earning job before they immigrated. But of course, the growth in the temporary migrant workers in Canada is not just in these high quality, high earning jobs. It's all throughout. And the IMP program in Canada is extremely complicated. It has so many classes and subclasses, and it's not been scrutinized. It's almost extremely difficult to even scrutinize it, period, from a researcher's perspective. So it's kind of a black box in terms of who's coming, what kind of experiences they're having, what kind of exploitation they're experiencing while they're here. There's a lot of exploration on a couple of smaller groups, such as the caregivers, like the former live-in caregivers or seasonal agricultural workers. And of course, these are groups that need to be examined. But the IMP is so much bigger than those groups, and yet we know very little about what's going on in that program.
If I can just interrupt, for those who aren't familiar, IMP stands for International Mobility Program. It is the only program in Canada where temporary foreign workers can enter without their employer having to go through a labor market impact assessment. And they are the ones that are transitioning in great number to permanent residency without that labor market impact assessment. Sorry, Rupa.
Sorry. So I guess what I'm saying is that for that one elite group of temporary foreign workers who have good paying, high quality jobs before emigrating, the two-step system does provide them with those soft skills that allow them to, take it to the next level and do well once they become permanent residents. But for the legions of others who are working through the IMP program, but not in such high quality jobs, it puts them at a real position of, a vulnerability to exploitation. And even, we focus on those who don't have any pathways to permanent residence. And yet, even those who have pathways to permanent residence, I think are vulnerable to that period of exploitation. We need to keep that in the front of our minds and somehow access data and access information on what is actually happening within the IMP stream.
Peter or Anna, do you want to address the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem in Australia is that we don't have as good longitudinal studies as you do in Canada. So we only assess the labour market outcomes several years post-settlement. And those studies do show that employer-nominated schemes are much more successful. But if you look at studies in Canada and the United States that take a much longer period of time, actually what you see is a convergence in streams over a longer period, and definitely for second generation. So it kind of depends on what you describe as success. And I think in Australia, we take an extremely short-term perspective on that. So if we were to conduct those kind of studies, and really it's a matter of financing in Australia, we might find that there's not much of a difference between the skilled independent and the employer schemes over time. And therefore some of the benefits of the skilled independent in terms of portability, capacity to change employers, and also a reduction in some of the discriminatory concerns that can arise with the employer scheme might mean that we should revert to a stronger emphasis on the skilled independent. So that's my view, that we need a bit better evidence base. I would say more broadly, especially with the focus on the temporary skills shortage, that yes, perhaps employers have had a bit too much of a say. But during COVID, that might not be such a bad thing, because we do want to only bring in migrants right now who are not going to present labour market competition for domestic workers. So I think the COVID period is a special one, but moving forward, this kind of more bird's eye analysis of what's going on would be useful.
Peter?
I'll jump in for the Oxford team, because I actually have a paper on exactly this question that you asked about, which of these systems works better. And I think, if you look at these systems on paper, employer-sponsored migration ought to do just a much better job, right? If you just look at what a points-based system is, in theory, it is a totally dreadful way of selecting anyone. In that, anyone who is able to get a job, because you're essentially, on the one hand, you have go through an interview process. The employer asks detailed questions, really assesses the fit with a particular kind of work. They have to identify a particular role that person can do, versus ask 10 questions. Now, okay, I'm obviously oversimplifying the ask 10 questions bit, which is the point system, but it is it is necessary, because of what it is. It has to be a crude set of criteria. And the UK's experience certainly the data is really bad, as Peter suggested, but it does tentatively suggest there's people who come in through the employer-sponsored routes, who come in for work, most of whom are skilled workers sponsored by employers, do very well. And then the kind of limited data we have about people who came in without a job offer through the 2002 program that Peter described don't seem to have done very well. But so in some ways, the surprising thing to me when I look at the Australian data is I can't quite work out why their outcomes for points for the skilled independent group are actually so respectable. It sort of seems to me to be a policy that kind of works despite the design, rather than necessarily because of it. But I do think that there is basically a trade-off. I think employer sponsorship is a good way, particularly in the short term, as Anna said, of giving you good outcomes right away. But you have this big problem of employer control that maybe you can mitigate through regulation. Countries like the UK aren't very good at actually doing that regulation. But in theory, you have this mechanism to be able to check that people are being paid the contracted wages and so forth. I kind of like the idea of the system, as I understand it in Australia, certainly in New Zealand, where you can essentially be on an employer-sponsored temporary visa, but you can apply for the points-tested kind of independent visa at any time. So you can kind of opt out of that employer control if you meet the criteria. And obviously some people won't meet the criteria. So that, I mean, that I think is the basic trade-off of these systems. The other thing, of course, that kind of is in the background here, and where I think the UK is very different from Australia and Canada, is just what the attitude is towards the numbers that you want to bring in through the systems. And I think point systems are good when you're sort of in the market for just admitting large numbers of skilled people into the economy as just more of a supply side policy. You know, we'll just boost the human capital pool and see where people land up. The UK has never really been as interested in that. It's much more taking the approach that essentially, you know, this is a very attractive country, lots of people want to come here, and the government is trying to find ways to reduce the numbers who actually come in and just select the people who are most able to, you know, to fare well in the labour market. So I think from that perspective, you know, the UK not being a country that is basically in the market for high levels of immigration, the employer-sponsored system probably is sort of more appropriate than a sort of a genuinely Australian style points-based system.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to some of the questions in the chat box. One of the questions had to do with whether point systems are effective or can they be adapted to address not just the really high human capital and highly skilled workers that we want, that there is competition for, as we heard this morning. But what about mid-skills? What about trade occupations? What about some of the lower skilled jobs? In Canada, it seems to be now that the express entry system is for the very high skilled, and the government is scrambling to do more for at least the mid-skilled through provincial nominee programs or through a whole variety of pilots to regionalize immigration, as opposed to changing the point system writ large. And therefore you have a lot of people filling the mid-level jobs and low-level jobs as being permanently temporary, with no opportunity to transition to permanent residency. So I'm wondering, in Australia and in the UK, has debate started about whether we should be focusing on more than just the very highly skilled, and whether there is consideration towards adapting or amending point systems to address the full continuum of labour market needs?
Yeah, so of course there's been like long-standing debate of this topic in Australia. Employers have often pushed for more formalised low-skilled programs. We bring in a lot of our low-skilled workers through the Working Holiday Maker program, which has obviously suffered during COVID, and we have a seasonal labour program for agricultural workers that doesn't have the best take-up by employers for a variety of reasons. But I think an enduring concern in Australia has been that if we were to adapt a low-skill points test visa, that it could increase labour market competition. So this kind of intentional aspect to bringing workers on a temporary basis, the idea that then there might be less displacement, although obviously that is challenged if there's a constant flow of temporary workers. It's just not good for the workers. So I have seen that debate coming episodically up in the policy area, especially pushed by different employer groups and industry groups, but I don't think it's really received a lot of traction. I would be very surprised if it were to be adopted now during COVID, where we do have slightly increased unemployment, because the evidence does suggest that the unemployment, if there's going to be a competition effect, that it's more likely to happen at the low skill end of the labour market. So yeah, it's been pushed, but even a more conservative coalition government has not accepted those proposals.
And what about in the UK? Peter or Madeleine?
Yeah, there's definitely been, I mean, there's been a big debate about this in the UK, specifically on the sort of issue of a points-based system. And I think the challenge for a points-based system to incorporate lower skilled jobs is just what are you awarding the points for? Because these are systems that are basically designed to select people with qualifications. And it's much harder to envisage what the criteria would actually be if you were looking at a low skilled system. I have seen, I saw there was a paper on, a fascinating paper on internal Chinese migration that I read years ago, which was saying that blood donation had been a criterion in a points system there to enable people to register in the cities. But I mean, you obviously, short of those kinds of things, it's quite hard, to design a points-based system to do this. I think so in the UK position has essentially been that, if there is migration at that in low-skilled jobs, it's either, well, in the past it was free movement from EU countries dealt with that, and so so there was considered that there was no need for any kind of visa option. Now that that's gone, anything that is going to be available at the low skill level is likely to, other than sort of working holiday makers and so forth, it's likely to be employer sponsored. But the UK position has basically been that has been reasonably hardline on low skill migration. So there's a seasonal agricultural workers program, and beyond that, everyone has to be in at least a middle skilled job earning a certain salary. And it will be very interesting to see what happens over the next few years. Particularly after we emerge from the COVID-induced recession, what happens to employers who became very reliant on EU citizens under free movement, and who will basically have no options to hire from overseas in low-skilled jobs.
Yeah, and there have been specific concerns about shortages in social care and in retail and construction. And what was interesting is that the latest system, there was a lot of emphasis on it being skills-based, and it is, but they actually lowered the skill threshold from high skill jobs, so those requiring a degree, graduate level education, to those requiring high school education, A levels or equivalent. So that shows that there had been some concern, presumably on the part of the government, for the middle skilled jobs and shortages there. Now all of that concern is on whether there are going to be serious shortages in the wake of the end of freedom of movement in lower skilled occupations, care being the one that's the big focus right now.
Okay. There have been a few questions coming in on credentials, and if we have a point system that looks at people's credentials, why is it so difficult for them to actually become employed using their full skills and their full credentials? But it's interesting that we have found, and Rupa talked about this, that even when academic credentials achieved abroad are in fact assessed as being equivalent to those in Canada, and even when internationally educated professionals are granted licensure by their occupational professional bodies, regulatory bodies, many still face barriers to employment commensurate with their qualifications. So is it really a matter more of employer resistance than inadequate selection? And if so, do any of you have suggestions or recommendations about how to overcome that employer resistance? And interestingly enough, given the role that employers play, they're still resistant to employ people making best use of their qualifications. So any suggestions? Rupa.
I think that's a really, really tough one, right? I think it's a matter of getting employers to truly buy in to the idea that immigrant workers' credentials truly are equivalent, even with that certificate or stamp. And it's really getting them to buy into the idea of true deep diversity. You know, like diversity and inclusion has become such a, a popular expression and a popular movement in sort of corporate culture, but those are still really very shallow expressions of diversity in many in many regards. And so I think that I don't have a great answer, except that I think, you know, it's a matter of truly getting the employer community to, and, you know, this does happen depending on where you're talking about. So I've spoken with employers in more remote places in Canada where they are just absolutely, you know, in need of workers, like to the extent that they are looking for foreign workers. And in fact, those employers, despite being in small rural communities, tend to be much more open. So it's really somehow impressing the business imperative of welcoming newcomers and actually appreciating the you know, the talents that they bring with them. And so, you know, there isn't a great answer to it, but I think until that really happens, all of these selection criteria are not really going to, you know, make the huge difference, because I think we've done a lot already in terms of optimizing the credentials to get the highest skill people. And now it's really a matter of then the reception side of it has not been addressed to the same extent. So, yeah.
Any of our Peter or Madeleine or Anna, anybody want to take a stab at that? Okay, then.
That's one, not so much for the UK system, because we don't have the same issues with credentials.
Okay, there was another question about youth and youth being a criteria for selection in the point system, certainly in Canada. I'm not sure about how prominently age is a factor in the other two systems. And I'd like to know that, but I'd also like to know whether you think that although youth is a kind of proxy for adaptability, and youth means that people, they will contribute, you know, for a longer time to the economy. My question is, do they stay? I mean, the research that I've seen is that young people are much more footloose and fancy free than families that immigrate, and that the retention rate is not necessarily terrific for the highly skilled who have lots of options. And one of the most important motivators for immigration is often a better life for their children. Most of the young people, or when you go down the age range and you look at the ratio between principal applicants and accompanying family members, certainly in Canada, there are many more people coming who are young and single as opposed to married and with dependent children. So although there are advantages to youth, are there potential disadvantages in terms of retention, given the mobility of young, highly skilled individuals and the talent grab?
I can answer that. I mean, we have a focus on age in the skilled independent category as well, although it doesn't sound like it's quite as strict as in Canada. I checked and the maximum points are up to 33, so a bit younger than in Canada. And I've argued in the past that this discriminates against women, the age category. Government has done modelling within finance and treasury that demonstrates that setting the age low has a very beneficial effect on contribution to Australia over the life course of the migrant. So that's why it's set in that way. It's very clear. So there's trade-offs there. I think that we have generally quite good retention of skilled migrants anyway. There are some categories where migrants sometimes get a visa and then leave and live offshore, a helicopter kind of approach, which I think you have with some of your visas in Canada. But generally the retention issue is more, for instance, with the portability between a student visa and a skilled independent visa than subsequently. So no, that's not necessarily a problem. And the Productivity Commission did a really good study in 2016 on Australia's migrant intake, which demonstrates the long-term contribution of skilled migrants to Australia, suggesting that we don't necessarily have this churn issue, perhaps because we have a better linking up of skills assessment and subsequent work than appears in Canada with the comparative studies that I've seen. So migrants, if they have a good lifestyle and they have a job and they start to have a family, then they're more likely to be retained.
And you,
In the UK, so we haven't assigned any points for age since 2011, and then it was quite lowly weighted. I think one could score a maximum of 15 for being 27 or under. That was in a points test where one could score a maximum of over 150 points. And I just don't think we have the evidence, Madeleine, as far as I'm aware, on such matters as retention and any kind of detail on the outcomes, but do correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I don't think we do. Well, I mean, I guess we know that a lot of people on skilled work visas come in temporarily and then leave. But one thing I will say is that the word retention is not something that figures in the UK debate, because to be totally honest, the UK government doesn't care about retaining people. In fact, the previous government, so the government that kind of set most of the structure of what we have as immigration policy now, it's in between kind of 2010 and 2015, had an explicit policy of trying to reduce retention. The wording was that we want to break the link between temporary migration and settlement. The idea being basically that temporary migrants come in, they pay some tax, and then it's great because they go home and they don't kind of use any services later on. They don't kind of do any of the expensive things like having children and so forth. So yeah, retention. There is, there's a lot of temporary migration in the UK, and generally, that's not controversial. It's not necessarily seen as a goal to retain a higher share of people.
In the Canadian case, again, like in Australia, there's a lot of evidence that younger applicants, younger immigrants do much, much better and contribute a lot longer to the Canadian economy. This is why the age, points have been set the way they have. That probably disadvantages a lot of people. And I think the biggest factor is we know that foreign work experience is valued almost zero. So having people with 20 years of work experience from abroad has not worked in the past, which is why it's really been set up now the way it has, with a real emphasis on brand new graduates and people who are graduating from Canadian universities. And I think this question of whether this is exploitative of people who essentially come and go to university here and paying the big bucks in order to then try to have a pathway to permanent residence is an important one. But in terms of the data, we know that younger people do better. Younger people tend to be more adaptable, and retention has not been a massive issue in Canada.
well, we have come to the end of this session. So thank you very much for everybody's questions. The chat box was very active. And thank you to all our panelists. It was great having you all here. So thank you very much to all.